is the origin or backstory of the Summit of the Americas, and what are its contributions to recent hemispheric history?
The first Summit of the Americas was held in 1994 during the administration of Bill Clinton. It was actually conceived of by Richard Feinberg, who was then the National Security Advisor for Latin America. He's a professor still at University of California, San Diego. And the idea was at the time you had basically every country, every state in the Americas, exception of Cuba, was headed by an elected, democratically elected head of state. And the idea was to create a club of democracies that could share the common goals of defending democracy collectively, of sharing best practices, of integrating the hemisphere, and then also to create a free trade area of the Americas. The idea was to create a then NAFTA-like free trade market area that would extend from Canada to Chile. And this had come, really, the idea had come around the heels of the implementation of the NAFTA agreement. And so the thought was, let's continue all the way down the coast of the continent of Central America and South America. But it was a different concept. This was a long time ago. It was 1994. The greatest threat to democracy at the time was seen as being military coups, not sort of the erosion of democracy from within. There was a sense of momentum, a unipolar world. It was relatively immediately right after the Cold War. So the idea of the United States was redefining a world order. There's no competition, ideological competition, really. It was a very sort of heady times, if you will, of sort of the idea of the end of history and triumph of democracy and all that stuff. And part of that too is this idea that democracies and markets, free markets and free trade go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And in fact, not only did they go hand in hand, they actually sort of led to this felicitous convergence in which we would all march happily towards the end of history. And I say that with due respect to my friend Frank Fukuyama. I don't mean to mockingly. The term is often used incorrectly in the way that from what he had intended. But that was a long time ago. That was 1994. To give you some context, I was still in graduate school. The Spice Girls, for example, had just formed. That was a long time ago. I'm now out of grad school, and the Spice Girls no longer perform. They may do a reunion tour, but the Summit of the Americas is probably not going to get together for a similar reunion tour anytime soon from what it did in 1994. Because what happened was, first of all, that countries, especially the Mercosur countries of the Southern Cone, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, began to suddenly bulk. The U.S. didn't necessarily want to lower its subsidies for agriculture. And Brazil and the countries of the Mercosur, which their economies survive and thrive on exports of agricultural goods, beef, chicken, soybean, wheat, corn, these weren't the deals that they wanted. So they began to sort of have second thoughts and get cold feet about the idea of free trade area of the Americas. The second issue that happened, and we started to see it in 2000, was the erosion of democracy by elected autocrats. Now, 2000, I say, because that was when Alberto Fujimori tried to contest an election for an unconstitutional third term. And in fact, began to demonstrate that with using popular mandates, elected officials may actually be the greatest threat to democracy, not actually military coups or military generals marching in. And so one of the other, if you will, sort of logros, successes of the Summit of the Americas was this creation in Quebec 2001 was this creation of an idea of a charter, Inter-American Democratic Charter, that was signed at the OAS to defend against the erosion of democracy from within, to define better democracy as representative democracies, as a series of checks and balances, as protections for freedom of expression and freedom of association, controls on executive power. And that stands, but it basically stands because it was never effectively implemented. History then caught up with the Americas. And what we saw, and already began to see in 2001, was the arrival of a wave of elected autocrats who, using their electoral authority and mandates, began to disassemble democracy from within. And consequently, we see now in many countries of the region that not only don't necessarily agree with this basic founding concept of the Summit of the Americas, are actively trying to subvert it as a way of avoiding accountability for human rights and democracy.
What is the state of the debate between different ideas and concepts, hemispheric integration? How have they affected the environment in the run-up to the Summit of the Americas? And why was the summit so controversial this year?
The first is you're right. There's always been this ongoing dream of integration, solidarity in Latin America and across the Americas, but as former Latin American and Portuguese colonies saw their legacy as slightly different than that from the United States. But the United States saw a shared history of post-colonial powers that were going to share the dream of democratic governance and human rights in this experiment. I mean, this is basically in the 18th and 19th century of democracy. Over time, that translated more and more into a rather paternalistic relationship on the part of the United States to sort of dictate democracies to how democracy functions, to intervene often to protect U.S.'s own security interests, to try to prevent extra hemispheric powers from intervening in the region, whether it was Spain or England or Russia. And so that also created a tension. So Simon Bolivar said that the United States is doomed to bother us with this notion, I'm paraphrasing, doomed to bother us with this notion of democratic solidarity. So the US had this idea of sort of shared democratic aspirations, but then for many Latin American countries, it was a process of shared sort of victimization by the United States and its interventions and economic pretensions and the like. And so you had two different conceptions of integration fundamentally. And as a result, the Latin American countries began to seek, really starting in the 19th century, to establish different treaties to ensure greater consolidation among themselves. First, for its own purpose, to promote trade ties, to be able to speak more forcefully in the international community, and to protect itself against the United States. And in the modern day, we've seen various manifestations of this. We see the Latin American Parliament, the Parlatino. We've seen there's ALADI. There's a common market of the Andean region. There's a common market of Central America. And then more recently, there was UNISOR, attempt to create this Union of South American Republics. And then CELAC, the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. It's an alphabet soup, basically, of these organizations. And Mercosur, don't forget Mercosur. And I'm sure I'm leaving a few others. Oh, there's a Parlacen, which is Central American Parliament. I'm sure but you can just imagine, just a jumble of letters. And the truth is a lot of these things were founded on very good notions of resolving disputes within Latin America internally, of, again, trying to improve the terms of trade, both in trade negotiations with the outside world, the extra hemispheric world, and with the United States, trying to create, if you will, sort of comparative advantages of education, of economies of scale. Some of these countries, economically speaking, were very small, El Salvador, Guatemala, and the like, so they made sense. And to also defend notions of national sovereignty. The truth is that a lot of these didn't really do what multilateral organizations have to do, is they weren't willing to surrender a certain amount of sovereignty to yield to create a greater collective good. They often sort of, the ideas of solidarity and autonomy sort of stayed in el aire. I mean, they stayed sort of at 10,000 feet. They never actually established sort of how to sort of bargain this. The second problem is that there is a great amount of change within Latin America politically. You had waves of democracy, waves of golpes militares, of military coups. You had military governments. You had waves of, populist governments, which Tulio Vargas or Juan Perón. You had, there was no consistency or policy of state in this regard. So that also tore apart the region. And then you had the United States with its own vision. And what happened in 1994 in Miami was, again, this idea that suddenly the region was united, that suddenly we're all democracies again. But that process of change within Latin America, of Latin American governments asserting their own sovereignty, of elections producing governments with very divergent views of the role they should have in the United States and the role of certain democratic institutions, even the role of human rights, really splintered that. So what happened was this resurgence of this idea of regional solidarity, free of, if you will, sort of exclusion. We're all brothers, we all hang together, and also free of actually collective commitments to defend certain things. And the truth is that the summit did agree that this was going to be a club of democracies, a club of elected heads of state. And while there may be differences on free trade, over the years from 1994 on, there were, important initiatives. They didn't often amount to much. They're mostly statements of collaboration. There was an effort briefly to include Cuba at the insistence of the then president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. And at the same time, the then President Barack Obama was engaging in his own opening to Cuba. So they invited Cuba to the summit in Panama, and then invited to Cuba in the summit in Peru. But this year, what happened was, first of all, you had a resurgence of governments that are really trying to lead the region away from the United States. And so the President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, for example, traveled to Cuba and said he's not going to attend if Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which were clearly not democratic states, which were clearly in violation of the original intent of the Summit of the Americas. He said, but he's not going to go unless they're invited. Now, a lot of people said, well, that's just U.S. politics. They're not inviting Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua because of because of the Cuban American lobby and conservatives in Congress and so on. Truth is basically by the very founding intent of the summit, they shouldn't have been invited. And so, but by the same token, you had the United States engaging in other forms of policies that weren't exactly in the idea of partnership. It had applied numerous sanctions to dozens of officials in Central America, in Guatemala and El Salvador, and in Honduras as well. And so their thought was, you know what, we don't want to go either. And why are they going to go to the United States and shake hands with the United States after the United States had kicked them in the teeth repeatedly by sanctioning? We can argue whether these were corrupt officials or not, but there is a certain tension between the U.S.'s sort of new role as guardian of all that is self-righteous in the hemisphere and the willingness of these countries to come. But last, there's also the issue of the world has changed also, and the U.S. can't offer free trade. Most countries don't want free trade, exception of Ecuador and Uruguay. But the U.S.'s free trade is, since with the Trump era, is kind of done for a while in U.S. politics. So it can't offer free trade agreements. It doesn't have the fiscal space to, and countries have become sufficiently advanced that they really don't qualify for U.S. development assistance in the past. So it doesn't have that sort of, big, deep pockets of development assistance. So there wasn't much it could really have on offer. And so there was a lot of ceremony, a lot of pomp and circumstance, but there wasn't, in fact, a large reason for a lot of these countries to travel to the United States, especially given their own sensitivities around the way the U.S. had treated them. And I'd add, too, the problem in the United States is the United States, the United States only has 2/3 of the ambassadors in the region are filled. So a third of the ambassadorships, countries do not have ambassadors from the U.S. for reasons of Senate confirmations or reasons of the White House not. You can ask yourself, why should a country that can't even fill a third of the ambassadorships, including to countries like Brazil and Chile, why should they go to the United States?
There is no question about the erosion of democracy in the hemisphere, yet, from some Latin American perspectives, where anti-US sentiment has always been present in some sectors, recent events highlighted that not even democracy in the US is a given. The hearings of the Select Committee investigating the Capitol Hill insurrection started in the exact same week the Summit of the Americas was taking place, and some of the information coming out of those hearings is thought-provoking in terms of the state of democracy. In this context, how has the perception of democracy affected the debate of which countries are democratic and which are not?
The first is, I don't think the U.S., it does less now of trying to dictate how democracy should behave than it has in the past, but it does still certainly express concern and sanction countries that deviate from democratic norms. But the problem, it isn't just the Summit of the Americas. in December last year, 2021, there was a summit of democracies. And that was a huge missed opportunity for the Biden administration to engage in some own self-reflection about the United States. And it didn't. In fact, it was really kind of a non-event. And the same thing with the Summit of the Americas. I think there is a moment in which the US can show a fair amount of empathy for the struggles of democracy in other countries, not just in Latin America. And you're right, we shouldn't, not all democracies in Latin America are struggling or at risk. There's variation. And the US is suffering many of the same ills, declining trust in public institutions, growing levels of political polarization, awareness and anger over racial exclusion and lack of rights and lack of social mobility. And with it, sort of the rise of populism and a declining commitment to democratic norms. I think the US missed an opportunity to engage in an honest reckoning of its own flaws and commit with the region to try to address them. And that's a shame, because I think that lack of empathy puts it in, as you're indicating, Alejandra, a much weaker position to be able to weigh in and advocate for particular reforms and even cooperate on levels of partnership. So you're absolutely right. I mean, on the bright side, we can say, is that, as you pointed out, there were hearings in the Congress over the attempted coup, the insurrection on January 6th, 2021. At least there is a process in the United States right now that domestically they're attempting to uncover, expose the intent of what happened and its real threat to democratic institutions and lives, in fact, too. And there are Capitol Hill guards that either died that day or later committed suicide, and there are threats against elected officials. There is a cleansing process in the United States going on, and a process of reckoning that Joe Biden didn't recognize, didn't cite. But of course, as we know, because of the levels of polarization, there are large segments of the country, the United States, simply don't believe that was an insurrection. They don't believe that people should be indicted for forcefully entering the Congress and trying to shut down a vote count and trying to wrongfully cite fraud and prevent a peaceful transition of power. I think the U.S. missed a huge opportunity to show its own solidarity with Democrats within the hemisphere. And I think, honestly, in some ways you hit on the point, is that shows a fundamental flaw in the Summit of the Americas process, should it be continued. We have to be, but the truth is the United States has to be honest with itself. It was going to be honest with other countries, and it has to be willing to be honest with the true idea of partnership. The U.S. throws out the term partnership all the time when it comes to Latin America. I mean, I joke with a couple of friends of mine who've written speeches for secretaries of state and president. Like, do you guys just cut and paste like a lot of this stuff? Partnership. It's everywhere. But true partnership means you're actually honest about your shortcomings. And I just don't think the United States measured up.